I have to compose myself a bit. I'm a bit jet-lagged also because I was in Greece up until Sunday of last week at the refugee camps, which was part of my father's legacy to make refugees welcome and stop the horrendous, brutal treatment of people whose only crime is that they were born in countries rife with wars that we probably helped cause by selling arms to bad people. But I'm very happy to be here today. I have to open up. Doug Ford is forever blighting my life because I have a cataract, and trying to get cataract surgery in Ontario is now virtually impossible, which is why my speech looks like something from Fidel Castro's length. But it's not, I can assure you. And it's a funny thing because at the end of my dad's life, he had macular degeneration, and his eyes were very bad. And I'm looking at, and the same font that I'm going to use today is the same font that he was using at 95 to deliver speeches. And I remember that I probably wasn't as understanding as I am now at how hard it is to read something when your eyes are a bit dodgy. And I remember that he was so good about it because when he did a major speech in 2014, and it was to 4,000 people in the United Kingdom, he had to use a teleprompter. This was the first time, and he practiced it the day before. And he practiced it 3 times. And I said, "Are you sure you've got it?" And he goes, yeah. There's no problem. And I'm thinking, this is a 91-year-old guy with bad eyesight who's going to be addressing 4,000 people in a room or in an auditorium and also live on television. And he's only practiced a teleprompter 3 times and he's 91. But as it happened, he knocked the speech out of the park, and that speech made him renowned in Britain, and then again renowned in Canada. And it's sort of, everything was sort of backwards the way we wanted it to be, because my father emigrated here to Canada in 1953, and he was both Canadian and he was British, and he was proud of both. But that his first fame came from Britain was some sort of an irony that he accepted, but he was always happy, or happiest sometimes, to be traveling through Canada and breaking bread with Canadians and telling his story about what it was like to arrive here in Canada in the 1950s and fight for a better Canada. And I think one of the greatest things was when he last came here to Calgary in 2015, Rachel Notley had been premier for just 4 months, and he was just so excited that this orange crush had happened in Alberta, especially since when the election happened and the NDP won here in Alberta, he was out in England fighting for the Labour Party that lost that election. So when Rachel won that night, he said, "Let me know, right? Wake me up if she wins. If she doesn't win, don't wake me up." So I woke him up and he was very happy. He was ecstatic because he saw that as a step in the right direction. And even though the NDP lost this election, and I even haven't even got to my speech yet, so it's funny, but even though the NDP lost this election, my father would have always said, "We will get there. That we will take the losses, but we will get there." And that is one thing that I have always taken from my father, that the optimism and solidarity that comes with trade unionism and with practical progressive socialism. Okay, now I should begin. Good morning, my name is John Mack Smith, and I shouldn't be here at this lectern speaking to you. I was not the original speaker booked. No, my original place should have been in the guest section because the person asked to speak was my dad, Harry Leslie Smith. He had been asked by your Labour Federation to explain what it was like to be born into a time when there was no social safety net, when health care was determined by your wealth rather than your illness, and workers who toiled from sunup to sundown lived in extreme poverty. My dad was an expert in all of those subjects and was intimately familiar with homelessness, hunger, and despair because he had been born 5 years after the end of the First World War into a family who earned their keep as miners in the north of England. As he often said, his life was not like an episode of Downton Abbey. I can't tell you how much I would have wished that he could have spoken to you today instead of me. Sadly, however, that cannot be, because in November, at the age of 95, he died from pneumonia. But when he died on November 28th, he died as he lived because he asked his doctor to discontinue life support measures, as there was no hope that he'd ever lead a life of independence and purpose again. But the mark of this man was that 3 days before he died, Canada's Minister of Refugees and Immigration came to visit him to thank him for his humanity towards refugees and his commitment to their well-being, which he proved when in his 10th decade he undertook a tour of refugee hotspots with me as his helpmate. So he may not have wished it, but he was ready to die as long as it could be on his own terms. And so on the day of his death, he asked for a beer and took some sips of it from a cup. Sated by the drink and a long life that had been well lived, his final words were, "Enjoy yourself, because it's later than you think." And after he had spoken, he fell into a long, dark sleep and died 12 hours later on a bleak, cold morning in Ontario. So it's why I'm here in Calgary before you, because my dad was insistent that I would complete his commitments to return our country back into the fold of being a progressive, forward-thinking nation, where everyone was free of want, had affordable housing, education, fair wages, and a public health care system that was in the hands of the people rather than the corporations. So I came here today because the warnings, the life lessons, the passions for social justice that my dad left us all in his books, essays, speeches, tweets, and podcasts are too precious to social democracy for them to be forgotten. As his son, his caregiver, and his best friend, I must try to preserve his legacy and relate to you the beautiful, remarkable, profound journey this man, my father, took through his almost 100 years of life on this earth. Many of you probably don't know much about my dad or his early life, except that for the last decade of it, he was known as the world's oldest rebel. Well, that's at least what the media called him when he died, but he never saw himself as the James Dean of socialism, even though he wore a leather jacket in old age and rode a motorcycle in his youth. No, my dad came from that generation of men and women who knew that each of us has a duty to our society, to our family, to our friends, and to our workmates to do the right thing. It's why, in my youth, my dad told me bedtime stories about the people who participated in the Winnipeg General Strike. I really like that because I wrote this long before I knew that we were going to be talking about the Winnipeg General Strike. So it's why my dad held as one of the proudest memories the time his father took him to a picket line during Britain's general strike of 1926 and rode him on his shoulders so that he could see workers fighting in solidarity for economic justice. My dad knew what was right and what was wrong with society from experiencing great poverty in his youth. He didn't learn socialism in school or through the theories of learned men and women. He learned it in the furnace of the Great Depression, when as a boy he was forced to scavenge in garbage cans behind restaurants in the town where he resided to feed himself. Because his dad had been let go from work, and poor relief in that era ensured that you would be homeless and hungry within weeks of your redundancy. Having to dig for food scraps like an animal when he was 8 years of age left a wound on my dad's soul that never healed. It's why, in his old age, my dad saw the dangers that would befall societies that were forced into austerity policies by neoliberal governments, because he'd seen this all before. Low wages for workers, unaffordable housing, and the vilification of the vulnerable were things my father had seen as a boy and teenager in pre-war Britain. He couldn't sit by and let his past become our future. So he stood up and demanded to be counted. And even though he was a man with no connection to the power brokers in politics or journalism, my dad set out in his old age to warn the younger generations that life under right-wing governments leads to inequality, to poverty, to environmental destruction, to societies where the few profit at the expense of the many with impunity. But my dad wasn't unique or a superhero. He was like your own dad, mother, or your granddad and grandmother, because they were all cut from the same cloth that was woven in the dirty 30s. That's why decades later they would be known as the greatest generation, because their life experiences were forged in a world before the welfare state. He was a witness and a participant to the greatest tragedies and triumphs that occurred during the 20th century. It's why in his 91st year, my dad proclaimed at Britain's Labour Party conference that he wasn't an historian, but that he was our collective history because of what he had endured through the first 30 years of his life. My dad was born in 1923 in a slum that grew in the town of his birth like gangrene on a festering wound. It was in that fetid warren that his eldest sister Marion contracted TB, and because his dad, a miner who worked 6 days a week on the coalface, didn't have enough money to send her to a sanatorium, she was sent instead to a workhouse infirmary to die in barbaric conditions. Because my dad's family were the working poor, without a penny to their name. His sister's corpse was dumped into a pauper's pit and buried with other indigents who couldn't afford a dignified burial. And the story of my dad's early life is not unique to England, because many of you will have similar tales to tell about your parents' or grandparents' trials and tribulations in Alberta during the dirty 30s. That no child or family today in Canada, because of our universal and public health care coverage, will face circumstances like my dad's family endured in England is a testament to the victories of the welfare state that so many people and trade unions fought so hard to create after World War II. But it cannot be taken for granted when Doug Ford governs the province of Ontario like it were a corrupt backwater southern state in the 1950s. And I don't need to tell you that after Alberta elected a rabid conservative premier like Jason Kenney, all bets that Canadians can do things better than Americans when it comes to the just society, public health care, public education, the rights of workers, or human rights must be taken off the table. Canada is in as much trouble as the United States, Great Britain, and many European countries because we may seem polite to outsiders, but I can tell you there is nothing kind or compassionate or polite about politicians that close safe injection sites or create an atmosphere where Islamophobia, homophobia, and transphobia flourish. There is nothing compassionate about cutting legal aid like Doug Ford has done in Ontario, and there will be nothing compassionate when Jason Kenney puts your province's most vulnerable into the sights of his austerity plans. When the Great Depression struck Britain in 1930, my dad was 7 years of age, and that was when his childhood ended, because the misery of his family's poverty forced his mother to indenture him to work as a beer barrow boy so that they could afford a small room in a dingy, decrepit rooming house located in a neighborhood spilling over with the victims of the Great Depression, which was caused by the greed of that era's 1%. While children of the well-to-do played games, my dad pushed a cart laden with beer that he sold on despair-filled cobble streets to the impoverished who longed for a short respite from their diminished lives that were being suffocated by an unequal economic system that turned his generation feral. Today, we must be vigilant because the same political ideology that introduced austerity to working-class Britain in the 1930s is the same ideology that will bring austerity to Alberta like it has already done to Ontario. I am always amazed and very proud of my dad because despite the brutality he faced due to an economic game rigged against the working classes in the 1930s, my dad didn't shirk his duty to civilization when Nazism threatened the world. It's why when my dad turned 18 in 1941, he volunteered in the RAF to do his bit in the war against Hitler. My dad knew, like most ordinary workers of that age, that Nazism was just as great a threat to democracy as unbridled capitalism. It's why my dad feared in his last years of life the rise of politicians like Donald Trump and the new fascism they preached to citizens made tired and vulnerable by a broken economic system. My dad was shocked and appalled and sickened to his very core by this new politics of hate that has infected Canada and the entire world over the last decade. It's why he engaged on campuses and on social media with the young of this country and in Britain to tell them that they will have to have the courage and determination that his generation had if they want to rebuild our nation on values that respect workers' rights, environmental rights, and human rights. It terrified my dad to think his grandchildren's generation was being bequeathed the world as uneasy as the one he had grown up in the 1930s. He said to me once, "I participated in the Second World War, so I know that fascism, unless defeated in its infancy, will lead us on a road that is covered in bloodshed, disorder, and war." He remembered to his dying day what it was like to live through 6 years of total war when millions were killed and millions more were made casualties. He never forgot the sacrifices made to deliver most of Europe from totalitarianism. It's why in his old age, he'd speak around the world to any group that would give him the opportunity to impart his warnings about how austerity and fascism are blood brothers. He also never forgot the pledge his generation made to future generations when Britain, Canada, America, and Russia were victorious against the scourge of Nazism. The cry was never again war, never again poverty, never again jobs that don't pay a living wage, because after all that bloodshed, his generation resolved to create a more equal world, a tomorrow that provided a decent future for their children, a world where merit mattered and the class system was history. My father's generation made the welfare state our birthright, and too many of our fellow citizens are hoodwinked by easy answers and the promises that low wages would lead to a life of personal luxury, surrendered it for a song to the 1%. While he was alive, my dad always lived in hope, always believed that humanity would stumble towards the light and not into the darkness. It's what motivated him over 60 years ago to become a migrant and move to Canada with his German-born wife, who he had met at the end of the war in the ruined city of Hamburg, where he was stationed as part of the occupying army. His wife, Frida, who would become my mother, was his salvation, because although she had suffered much in Hitler's Germany due to the fact that she was the illegitimate daughter of a trade unionist, she never learned to hate. My mom's heart always leaned towards compassion for the vulnerable, and she taught my dad how to overcome the brutality he had endured as a boy and learn to accept love again. Without my mother's empathy, my father's life would have been different. He still would have been a good man, but there would have been a thick, callous skin over his soul. It was coming to Canada that freed both of them from the burdens of their past, and it was the progressive politics of the 1960s It was the progressive politics of 1960s Canada that allowed my parents to become part of the middle class because of this country's commitment to building a nation where all prospered, not just the entitled few. But my father never looked at his early years in Canada through rose-colored glasses, because in the 1950s and early 1960s, our nation's healthcare services were private. When people would boast to him about Canada's universal healthcare, he would tell them about a friend of his in the early 1960s who had been a survivor of the Holocaust and couldn't keep a job because of PTSD and had to borrow money from my dad to pay for the services of an anesthetist for an operation his wife required. My dad knew that to protect the welfare state, you must be vigilant. And if you give an inch to a politician like Jason Kenney or Doug Ford, they will take a mile of it and sell it off to private interests. Everything from health care to pensions is at risk as long as we have right-wing politicians like Kenney in Alberta and like Ford in our provincial legislatures, because they are not going to stop with ruining the lives of the residents of their own provinces. No, they are going to war with Ottawa and are going to fight tooth and nail to install a mirror image of their own governments in our capital during the next federal election. At the end of his life, my dad should have been able to look back and celebrate the great social progress that had spread across the world since he had been born. But he couldn't, because all that he and his generation had fought for had begun to shrink with the speed of a polar ice cap retreating under climate change. It all began with the rise of politicians like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Ralph Klein, and Mike Harris during the last decades of the 20th century, who promised that lower taxes for the 1% would lead to greater prosperity for the 99%. It didn't, but what it led to instead was hollowed out societies, broken cities, homelessnesses, and dysfunction. It led to the crushing austerity of the 21st century and the rise of food banks, which should have been a temporary measure, but are now normalized features of every city, town, and village in Canada. Now, thanks to those politicians and our modern ones, ordinary citizens are overwhelmed with increasing personal debt, lower wages, and a gig economy that has left workers fearful of how they are going to make the rent and buy groceries on their take-home pay. My dad knew when the banking crisis hit the world in 2008 and 2009 that the world was slipping back towards a mindset that reminded him of his boyhood, where the poor languished in squalor and the rich lived well on undertaxed wealth. He saw that our lives today were starting to have the same edge, the same cruelty, and the same divisions that polarized the 1920s and 1930s. Like yesterday, we have become a world divided by those that have and those that have not. It was those divisions in Europe and North America, along with extreme poverty, perverted ideologies, and lack of a social safety network, which were contributing factors to the Second World War, the Holocaust, and ultimately Europe being divided by an Iron Curtain for over 50 years. It's why my dad's last stand was trying to make refugees welcome, not only in this country, but in Europe. When we first went to visit a refugee camp in Europe, I had never seen my father so upset. He was shaken and ashen-faced. When we were alone, he wept, but it was tears of anger that he cried, because he had seen this all before at the end of the Second World War, when his unit had fed and cared for refugees that were fleeing the carnage that was all around them. This time, however, compassion was in short supply, as politicians like Donald Trump used racism as a means of political control. And this is where the lessons of my dad's generation must be heeded. Whether it was in the Britain of my dad's youth or today in Canada, when it comes to the shameful treatment of our less fortunate citizens, the establishment has always believed in the saying, "out of sight is out of mind." Since the global financial crash of 2008, Canada has seen troubling increases in food bank use, an increase in child poverty, the rise of precarious work, and an affordability crisis for families. Meanwhile, wealth inequality has worsened, secure jobs are harder to find, especially for our youth, and real wages have stagnated and precipitated a hollowing out of the middle class. This has occurred not because taxation has become too burdensome on ordinary citizens, as right-wing demagogues argue, but because of the high cost of living in a country with diminished public services resulting from conservative government cuts. During the Great Depression, the youth of my dad's generation were sacrificed, first through unfettered capitalism, the greed of unregulated industrialists, government incompetence, and myopia, and finally press-ganged into the charnel house caused by the Second World War. Today, his children's generation is also being sacrificed, and it must end. But for this to end, we have to start looking at who benefits from austerity and the death of the social safety network. It's not you or me, it's not the poor, the middle class, or new immigrants who benefit from austerity and the end of social services. No, nor will it be our children or grandchildren. No, it is just the very rich multinational corporations, the elite, and right-wing governments that benefit from austerity. Let's never forget that austerity isn't an economic tool. It's a political tool to recalibrate society so it only works for those at the top of the heap. That is why Doug Ford's government in Ontario and Jason Kenney here in Alberta present such a great risk to our civilized society. Their attacks on democratic institutions and their message of austerity and restraint to the 99% and untold wealth to the 1% will return Canada to the dog-eat-dog world of my dad's boyhood in the 1930s. In Ontario, the Ford government has changed the ground rules for politics and for Canadian society because they have no respect for facts, for journalism, for trade unions, for compassion, for public health care. It won't be long before that tsunami of hate, greed, and indifference for the less fortunate strikes Alberta with disastrous consequences for everyone but the very rich. Doug Ford has robbed the vulnerable of their benefits through massive cutbacks to universal programs and social services. They are dismantling OHIP, removing the rights of tenants to fair rents. This government has waged a protracted war against trade unionists and pitted private sector workers against public sector workers. And let's be clear, Doug Ford has used the politics of hate and fear against refugees when he tried this summer to draw an inference to lack of affordable housing in Toronto and an increase of refugee claimants in the province's capital? And how do we fight back and defeat the night kings of austerity that have grabbed hold of this province in Alberta and in Ontario? My dad knew how. It's through trade unionism, through advocacy, through social media, through speeches, through voter registration, through talking to the young and listening to the young. In the end, my dad knew that we could only defeat the darkness of the politics of the right by telling stories and inspiring people to believe that they matter by providing political policies that will improve their lives as quickly as possible. It's why he was a tireless advocate for a living wage that enables all citizens to have an adequate standard of living, because it's not a living wage if you can't pay the rent. We must ensure that education is affordable to all of our young, not just the kids of the 1% and upper middle class. We have to have affordable childcare from coast to coast, pharmacare, and dental Medicare. As my dad said in his books, it's time we start looking at housing as a nest rather than a nest egg, which is why we have to start investing in affordable housing for all of our citizens. Canada should expand, not diminish Medicare and public pensions. My father told people in his speeches and in his books that we must all remember that we are worth more than the profits of the hedge fund managers. We are worth more than flat wages, high student debt, and few prospects. We are worth more than a cost of living crisis that ensures that many will never have a home to call their own. We are worth more than corporations who won't pay a living wage and hide their profits offshore in tax-free havens. You and every resident of Alberta are all worth more than a Jason Kenney government that will govern with the politics of intolerance, fear, greed, and the politics of intimidation. Throughout his life, my dad didn't allow himself to fall into despair, because although he had experienced much heartache in his youth and in his 60s when my brother Peter developed schizophrenia and was horribly abused by the Mike Harris government, and then, much later on, at the age of 50, died from pulmonary fibrosis when my father was 87. He understood that he had been blessed with much joy and happiness, thanks in large part to a functioning welfare state that allowed him to reach his true potential rather than be a nameless cog grinding out his days for the well-being of the entitled. It's why during his last political campaign in Ontario's provincial election, he asked voters to use their hearts and their heads when it came to the ballot box and vote for economic and social justice rather than hate, which only profits the self-interests of the entitled. When the next federal election occurs this fall, we must fight like my father did all his life for a country where all share in its bounty. I'm going to leave you with two things before I finish up. My dad began writing his first book at the age of 87 in 2010, and at his death he was working on his sixth book, which dealt with the refugee crisis. My dad never had the opportunity to go to university and left school at 14 to work as a grocer's assistant before the Second World War. My father's education came first from his local library, then from officers he met in the Second World War who were socialists and understood that my father was bright and articulate. Finally, my dad's education came from his wife, who was able to teach him German so he could understand another culture. My dad was just an ordinary guy who was determined over the last years of his long life to not let his past become our future. So, I'm going to leave you now with a video so you can see why I was really proud of this guy. And I am one of the luckiest people in the world that he was my dad, because this is a video he made for the Guardian newspaper in Britain about the refugee crisis and why it matters to us to do the right thing now. And like I said, if he could have, he would have been here, because one thing he believed in was that all workers should get a life that was as blessed as his. So thank you.
My character has been forged by the experiences I witnessed during the Second World War. As the war drew to a close, I thought I had seen everything and believed nothing could surprise me when it comes to the cruelty of so-called civilized men. But when my unit arrived in Hamburg as part of the occupation army in May 1945, I encountered in their thousands refugees from the war who had fled the advancing Soviet army and the victims of Hitler's Holocaust against the Jews. Looking at them as I travelled through the city on the back of an army truck, you could no longer tell who was rich or poor. You couldn't tell who was an intellectual or a worker or a thief or a rogue. All I could tell was the war had stolen everything from them but the will to survive. Britain, along with our allies, worked tirelessly to save those refugees from a miserable life in squalid camps. In fact, Britain settled over 200,000 Polish refugees at the end of the war. One of them, Mickey, became my best friend. When he was dying 8 years ago, his mind didn't wander to the land of his birth, but instead it roamed to Scotland, where he had arrived as a refugee, but was welcomed as a friend and fellow citizen. All through his life, he never forgot that his good fortune came because others extended the simple hand of human kindness towards him. Last November, I travelled to Calais to see the jungle for myself. I met those refugees seeking entry into Britain and a life free from the wars of their homelands. It wasn't a pretty place, and it reminds me sadly too much of how the world looked 71 years ago, when Europe still smouldered from the dying flames of the Second World War. Like then, the people in the jungle's lives have been shorn of hearth, home and kin. Today, however, politicians in Britain have turned their back on humanity, which is as brutal as averting your eyes from a sinking ship. The tearing down of these makeshift shelters is a new low. Considering there are over 60 million people across the globe displaced by war or brutal dictatorial regimes, we can no more ignore this tragedy than a person can ignore the cries of an abandoned child in their backyard and call themselves human.
Good.